Welcome, everybody, to Reaper Point Volcanology, a narrative series. Please clear some time, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Assembly 3. Design 3.1. I was resting against the wall with the open door frame, using my pack as a backrest against the wall. The probe was no longer clipped to my pack and was just resting upright, propped against the wall. I had pulled out my phone and noted the battery draining dangerously quick in the cold pack, so it was now tucked into an internal pocket of my thermal suit. I had also powered it off to conserve battery. I was thinking about exploring the rest of the basement here, but ultimately decided against it for the time being. Sarah was across the room sitting by the filing cabinets. The cable was still wedged under one of them a meter or so away from her. She was engaged with the device she used to analyze the contents of the air coming out of the rift earlier. The rift was still ominous as ever. I was situated about 6 or 7 meters away, and absent-mindedly watched as it continued to belch out soot and foul-smelling vapor. The wind from the storm blowing fresh air in through the hole was our only olfactory saving grace. The storm had ramped up enough outside that there was a noticeable amount of snow blowing in through the opening as well. The flakes collected on top of the black soot, contrasting like salt and pepper across the floor. The hail had begun as well. I could hear the ice pounding the ground and the walls of the building outside. Being in the basement was comforting for the sense of safety against the barrage from the heavens, but equally uncomforting from the hellish presence of our volcanic friend. Hailstorms were relatively uncommon. I had experienced 2 in my year as residence, but I had always had plenty of time to shelter back at home prior to their arrival. Apparently, though, hailstorms were common enough to justify a categorization system for determining appropriate action. They go over this sort of information during the orientation to Reaper Point when you take up residence. Unlike most people, I actually remembered most of it. The numbers go from 0 to 5. A category 0 is considered low risk. Shelter is recommended but not necessary, and being struck is unlikely to harm either people or property. Categories 1 and 2 are medium risk. Shelter is necessary as the falling ice is large enough to cause injury to people and cosmetic damage to property. Categories 3 and 4 are considered high risk. The ice can be large enough to be fatal if struck, and property is at risk for structural damage. The lifts are decommissioned for the duration of the storm, and the gondolas are sheltered in a large warehouse near the train station. Category 5 is the most extreme. It presents high likelihood of death to people who are unsheltered, and severe risk of total destruction to property. Thankfully, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any recorded Category 5 hailstorms, and only a rare handful Category 4s. Both of the hailstorms I had experienced so far had been Category 2s. I was brought out of my own head by the sounds of Sarah moving about across the room. She was stowing the device in her pack and rummaged around the other contents. She finally leaned back on the filing cabinet again and reached for her walkie-talkie. "Dr. Beckman to comm station. Do you read me? Over." A long pause ensued. "This is comm station. I read you." The voice was still Joseph, despite many hours passing and the light starting to fade outside. I realized he was as trapped in the communication station as we were here. "Could you inform the Glenn siblings of our situation?" "Sure thing. How are you guys doing?" "Not too bad. It's relatively warm here because of the venting. I've been checking the gas content of the room. Not something we should be breathing in all the time, but it's fine for now. I think we'll try to find a room on the first floor if it isn't too cold." "Sounds good. Anything else you need from me?" "Nope, we're good to go. Over and out." Sarah posted one arm on the ground and clambered to a standing position. She attempted to dust herself off, but the black soot was particularly apparent on the yellow of her thermal suit. My own yellow vest was largely dulled to the point of being useless as a visibility aid. She called over to me. "Hey, you awake over there?" "Awake as I ever am." I realized that I had slouched so far against the wall that my pack was only supporting my upper shoulders and head. The majority of my body was parallel to the floor. "I'm gonna go poke around upstairs. You want to tag along?" "Sure, I'm game." I groaned as I fought to get upright again. I left my pack on the ground and tailed Sarah as she strode through the empty doorframe. The doorway entered into a long rectangular room. More filing cabinets lined the wall on our right. At the end of the room was a small skylight near the ceiling with miraculously intact glass that bled in the last bits of sunlight. The left wall was largely blank, but opened to a slender staircase at the far end. Sarah made a beeline for the staircase, and I was a couple steps behind. The sounds of wind roaring through the streets and ice pelting the walls grew louder and louder as we ascended the steps. The top of the stairs exited into one end of a wide hallway. The hallway ran about 15 meters with two large archways on opposite sides halfway down its length. The sounds of the storm seemed to be emanating from at least one of those archways. There was distressed red carpet running down the length. Portraits were hung systematically along the beige walls of the hallway. Most of them were in relatively good condition. They were all in the same format, three-quarter view mugshot underlined by their name, title, and year range, presumably marking their time of significance. We wandered past a couple portraits before Sarah stopped and jabbed a finger at one. "Are you kidding me?" she blurted out while still holding her finger up to the glass where the name was written. I can't believe he weaseled his way into any sort of recognition. Sarah marched off and muttered something about bureaucracy that I couldn't quite catch. I stepped closer to take a better look at the face and inscription. The man in the picture appeared to be in his 30s, with a brick-like square head and jaw. He had black hair that was slicked back and was impeccably clean-shaven. The gray pinstripe suit he wore in the picture made the parallels to a mob boss almost impossible to avoid drawing. The name, title, and years were written in swoopy cursive font and read Antonio Brunning, Chief Operations Officer, 2083 to 2095. By the time I had finished inspecting the portrait, Sarah was already halfway down the hallway, looking between the two openings. I jogged over to avoid being left behind. Once I reached the juncture, I could evaluate our options. The archway to the right opened to the front lobby area. There were rows of reception booths on either side of the large circular room. The remnants of the front door had swung ajar a long time ago and were slowly swaying in the gusts of wind that blasted through the open frame. Balls of hail littered the first couple meters of the lobby near the door, ranging from small ball bearings up to full fist-sized lumps. More were slowly scattering in with the wind. Outside, I could see the snow comprising the road becoming a pockmarked, cratered lunar surface by the falling debris. I saw a couple scarily large basketball-sized hail spheres cannonball into the ground with large bursts of dislodged snow and ice marking their arrival. Feeling a little more uneasy about our general safety, I turned around to look out the other archway. It opened up to another circular room, but this one was a large atrium, 2 stories tall, and had a circumnavigating spiral staircase leading up to the second floor. The perimeter was lined by large windows with vertical metal bars. The glass had probably long since shattered and was now littering the floor along the outside of the room. Hail small enough to sneak between the bars was plinking down the steps and collecting at the bottom. Sarah likely had the same impression as I did because she was already walking down the unexplored length of hallway rather than deviating out to either of the circular rooms. The other half of the hallway was much like the previous, with more portraits lining the walls. Our boots were leaving a trail of black sooty footprints on the red carpet. I didn't recognize any of the faces in the portraits as we walked along, but I wasn't very steeped in the history of Reaper Point. At the end of the hallway was a set of large wooden doors. They were fairly ornate with intricate carvings bordering the edges and a lacquered finish so thick it looked fake. Sarah cautiously pulled open the right door using the large brass handle. The door squealed open on hinges that probably hadn't moved in a decade. Revealed was an enormous conference room. It ran about 15 meters deep from the door and was about half that in width. Tables arranged in a U shape filled the space, with chairs lining the exterior perimeter. The walls were plastered in the same beige wallpaper as the hallway. It had dark wisping patterns along the floorboards and near the ceiling. There was a waist-high counter that ran down both the right and left sides of the room, with numerous wooden drawers. The ceiling itself was high and patterned with small terracing steps built into the concrete. The hail striking the roof could be heard even through the thick material. The small hail was damped completely by the solidity of the ceiling, but the more dangerous strikes were powerful enough to make their presence known. I crept into the room behind Sarah. Despite knowing the place had been abandoned for years and the noise of the storm filling the building, I still felt the urge to be stealthy and polite on account of the niceties and decor. We started milling about the room, looking around at the tables and in the drawers. I wasn't really sure if we were looking for anything specific. Sarah probably had some idea of what she wanted to find, but I was just sightseeing. Most of the drawers I rifled through contained meeting notes. Piles and piles of meeting notes. Meeting notes so numerous that I was convinced you could spend the rest of one's life reading them, and you still wouldn't finish. I idly scanned some of them, but found nothing of particular interest. Business structure, finance, and strategy weren't on my short list of passions. Apparently, Sarah did find things of interest, because she had her phone out and was taking pictures of a couple documents she had laid out on the counter across the room. While she was doing that, I slid out the closest chair to me and dumped myself into it. I was getting hungry, but didn't want to break into the food I had packed quite yet. "What'd you find over there?" I called out across the room. "Just some reference material," she replied casually while finishing up the last of her pictures. I wasn't sure if she was so brief because it was actually dull material, or if I was supposed to take a hint. I played it safe and left her to finish her documentation in peace. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the hail for a moment. It was a certain kind of calming to be indoors while the storm raged outside. The feeling of knowing about, but not being in, the unpleasant environment was satisfying. My moment of smugness was swiftly destroyed by a thunderous, explosive detonation that made me jump out of my chair. It was hard to see what happened at first. Dust filled the air, and a cascade of snow and ice streamed in from somewhere. I started backing toward the direction I assumed was safest, which was the door we came in. Once the initial shock faded, I understood what happened. The ceiling had a hole punched through it about 1.5 meters squared. Bits of the concrete were still raining down, and the hail from the storm was streaming in through its new entryway. On the floor beneath the new precipitation was the remnants of the ceiling and large shards of ice from the initial incident. The sheer amount of ice was the worrying part. If reassembled, it would likely total the size of a mini-fridge. We both stared at the pile of rubble and ice, shocked for what felt like an eternity. I snapped to Sarah, "Should we? Yeah, move." Design 3.2. We hurried back across the building in the way we had arrived. The pace was a mixture of rushed walk and careful jog. I noted the front doors in the lobby swaying with more animation as we passed the archways. I was thankful to have at least 2 layers of concrete over my head in the rest of the building. The unpredictable threat of death by ice was forefront in my mind. As we descended the stairs back into the basement, the stench of volcanic gases hit us again about halfway down the flight. That was one thing I wasn't looking forward to living with for the rest of the night. It was also very dark. Most of the light from outside was gone at this point, and my eyes could just barely make out my path. I let out a tired sigh as I dumped myself on the floor where I had left my pack and leaned back against the wall. I looked over to the hole that we had entered the basement from to see a small pile of various sized small hail collecting in a pile beneath the opening. It was sheltered from the larger hail by the building next door, so I wasn't worried about a bowling ball racing through it and taking one of us out. I still considered trying to block it with something if I found the energy later. Sarah had sat down in the same spot she was before, across the room by the filing cabinets. She had her phone out and was slowly scrolling on something. I wondered if it was the documents she captured earlier. I pulled out my own phone and powered it back on briefly to check the time. It was 10:22 p.m. I shut it down to stow it in my pack and made the executive decision to break into the bars that I had brought along before trying to sleep for the rest of the night. I wasn't planning on keeping the food all to myself, though, so I hauled my tired body off the ground and walked myself and my pack about a meter from Sarah and took a new seat. I had my pack in my lap and rummaged into the pouch I had stowed them earlier. Upon retrieving them, I poked Sarah in the arm with one of the foil-wrapped bars to deviate her attention away from her phone. She looked at the item and then to me. "Oh, I'm good. Not the first time I've gone a day without eating." I kept holding it out. "Oh, I'm well aware. Just take it." She paused for a beat before reaching over and receiving it. She started unwrapping the foil before stopping. "Thanks. I appreciate it." "No worries," I replied as I took the first bite of mine. I finished my bar rather quickly. It wasn't close to satiating, but the bump in calories was nice. I stuffed the wrapper in an outside pocket of my pack and picked myself up again to look where I wanted to sleep. I immediately headed into the attached room and eyed up the tops of the filing cabinets. They were around chest height, with relatively little dust, and were in the quieter of the two rooms. I figured getting myself off the concrete would also prevent the floor from leaching warmth from me. I brushed off the surface and pitched my pack on top. I poked my head back into the other room. "Hey, Sarah." She looked up from her phone, which she had returned to. "I'm going to go horizontal and get some sleep. I think the tops of these filing cabinets is probably the best spot to crash." I motioned into the other room with my thumb over my shoulder. She thought about it and looked around. "Good call. I'm going to keep reading. I'll find my way over there when I'm done." I nodded and turned back into the attached room. "Have fun." I lazily hopped up and rolled myself on top of the cabinets. My hard-shell thermal helmet was as good a pillow as anything, so I left it on with the visor open for the fresh air. It took some shimmying around to find a reasonably comfortable position for my bones to rest. I laid there listening to the sounds of the storm. It took a while for me to get any sleep, and when I did, it wasn't for very long. I was intermittently jolted awake by impacts of the large ice meteors in our nearby vicinity. I was marginally awoken by Sarah entering the room and taking a spot further down the row of cabinets, half a meter from my feet. At some point in the night, a particularly large strike must have broken through a roof on the first or second floor, because the sound beamed straight down the stairwell a couple meters from me and scared me half to death. Shortly after that, the small window in the room shattered, likely from an errant hail strike. The cold air that started pouring in the new opening was most unwelcome, but I was too tired and lazy to do anything about it. The temperature dropped a noticeable amount in the ensuing hours. I ultimately awoke not feeling terribly rested. Light was leaking in the shattered remains of the window. I got up more because I was cold with the new airflow than actually wanting to be awake. I noticed the distinct lack of noise. The storm had likely subsided in the early morning, which gave me a couple hours of uninterrupted rest. I sat up, careful not to bump my head on the ceiling, and immediately noticed Sarah missing. I figured she was just finding something to keep busy while I slept and wasn't particularly worried. I slid off the cabinet and started pacing around the room. I shook my limbs and wiggled about to warm up and work off the residual stiffness from sleeping on a metal box all night. I peeked into the larger room next door. The volcanic chasm was still belching out vapor and soot into the room. The floor looked more densely covered in the dust already, but I couldn't remember enough of what it looked like when we first arrived to be sure. The smell of the volcanic fumes was largely lost on me at this point, which I took as concerning in some regard. The pile of hail that was collecting under the entrance hole had grown considerably, and small spheres of hail could be seen as far out as the middle of the room beneath the probe that still stood as a monolith there. Satisfied that I wasn't missing anything major, I made my way to the stairs and started ascending up to the first floor. The hallway looked largely as it was yesterday, apart from a noticeable pile of snow and ice spilling out from the left archway. Once I reached the threshold, it was clear what happened. The majority of the ceiling in the large spiral staircase room now rested on the floor, mixed in with a similar portion of shattered ice chunks. The debris covered almost the entire floor of the circular room, with a concentration in the center. The boulder of ice that caused the damage must have been unfathomably large for an object falling from the sky. I figured this was the perpetrator of the amazingly loud crash during the night. I turned around and glanced over to the lobby room. There was no more notable damage to speak of there. I saw the door to the conference room slightly ajar and wandered over in my search for Sarah. Upon opening the door, I was greeted by Sarah sitting on the left countertop about halfway down the room, nose deep in a massive pile of papers. I was massively unsurprised by this finding, and I quietly trudged over to her. Sarah looked up from a paper she was reading as I got close. "How'd you sleep?" I shrugged. "Can't complain, I guess. Glad I wasn't in that staircase, though. Did you see that?" "Yeah. I suspect that storm will be retroactively upgraded to a Category 4. That much damage is pretty intense." I nodded. "So what have you been up to this fine morning?" She motioned to the multiple stacks of paper. "Just been going through some of the old COO's reports, looking for good reference on how he talked to stakeholders." I nodded dumbly. I wasn't really interested in the topic before I remembered. "Wait, COO, that portrait you snapped at yesterday? What was it, Antonio?" Sarah sighed. "I was hoping you wouldn't remember that. Yes, him. I may not like the slimy asshole very much, but he was a hell of a salesman. Probably how he got the position in the first place." "Ah, I see." I pulled out a chair at the table nearest to her and took a seat. There was an uncomfortable silence for a couple seconds before Sarah went back to reading the page she was on, and I just spaced out staring at the wall. "We can start heading back," Sarah said, picking up the pile of paper and tapping the ends on the counter to straighten them. "I don't mean to keep you here." "I'm just existing," I replied lazily. To be honest, sitting down felt nice. "You can finish whatever you need to." No, I'm good. Let's hit the road." Design 3.3. Sarah stowed her papers in her pack, which prompted me to remember I forgot my own pack on the filing cabinet in the basement. We started to trudge our way back down to retrieve it. Upon reaching the room again, I yanked it off the countertop, wiping a shower of dust onto the floor and creating a solid black smear on the right-hand side of my pack. I postponed putting it over my shoulders and just held it in my hands so I could throw it through our basement exit port ahead of myself and crawl through without the extra encumbrance. Standing up outside gave me my first taste of the storm's true scope. Every exposed patch of snow was pockmarked and cratered. The divots ranged from almost imperceptible to impact zones a couple meters across and a meter deep. Some still had the perpetrating ice spheroid resting largely intact in their centers. The buildings along the street had sustained significant damage. Any exterior corners had chunks gouged and chipped off, creating serrating patterns. Some buildings had holes punched through the walls, and I'm sure there was more damage to the roofs, but nothing I could see in the immediate vicinity had been struck by anything on the scale of what happened in the spiral staircase in the post office. That was the one relieving factor I saw. I turned around to see Sarah finish crawling out of the post office. When she was standing up, I posited, "I hope the east side didn't get hit this hard." Sarah gave a quick survey of the landscape before replying. "Agreed. Normally the east side is a little more sheltered, but there is a real risk of damage." She started pulling out the safety tether rope from her pack and continued talking. What I'm really worried about, though, is the comm station being hit bad. I haven't been able to reach anyone all morning. I'm not even sure the lifts are in functioning order. I let that sink in for a while. That would suck. How far is it from here to our house? Like 10 kilometers? Closer to 15, probably? Sarah clipped the rope ends to both of us and started walking out into the road. I sat thinking for a moment as she sauntered off. I grabbed my radio on my suit and called over. Hey, wait a second. Sarah turned around and walked a couple paces back to me. What is it? Just so you know, we left that probe in the basement. I don't really want to carry it all the way back, so as long as you're fine with just leaving it here, that's what I'd like to do. Yeah, that's fine. Someone else can retrieve it at some point. She started walking off again. I stood there and let the rope spool out. Once it neared the end, I started after her. The route Sarah took down the street was serpentine and non-linear. She took great care in avoiding the largest of the impact zones, but because of their prevalence, we were rarely going straight down the road. I would have thought she was taking too much care in avoiding them, but I figured she probably knew something I didn't. This pathing continued as we headed down the street. We were traveling towards the trunk street, back the way we originally arrived. It would have been hard to remember landmarks to tell me how far we were without everything getting a ballistic makeover during the night. I did remember the meter-high shelf, though, and when we crossed that, I knew we were almost back to the lift. Or where the lift should be. As we reached Trunk Street, it was clear we weren't getting any help in getting home. The columns that normally held the cables in the air were still in their sheltered configuration. The poles retracted into silos beneath them, leaving the pulleys and guides that control the cables the only component proud of the ground. The cables themselves were draped on the surface of Trunk Street, lining the route that the lift would take if it were operational. Sarah had stopped at the edge of Trunk Street, and I walked up alongside her. Guess we're shit out of luck, she posited once I had arrived and flipped up my visor. Seems that way, I replied, surveying the lift. I didn't want to think about the trek back on marginal sleep and little food. I sighed. So, how do we get back now? We'll have to take the service road from Branch 15. It should be the quickest route. Not sure how maintained it'll be. Might get a little dicey at times. Lead the way. I motioned up Trunk Street. Our progress up the slope was slow and labored. The incline of the road made the journey already difficult, but the labyrinth of pits and craters we now needed to traverse added noticeable distance to our ascent. It became a steady dance of rhythmic steps and heavy breathing during the effort. I had to flip up my visor to avoid fogging it up and to get new air into my helmet. I watched the signs for the branches as we passed them, making mental check marks of our progress. Although I wasn't great at telling time, it was easier with these shorter milestones. It was likely 10 minutes between each branch, which equated to an hour hike up the mountain to reach Branch 15. The level of relief when we finally turned onto Branch 15 was immense. Sarah drove an unrelenting pace, and the previous hour drained much of what little energy I had left. I spent much of our ascent idly wondering if Sarah's brain and body were fueled by some hidden mystic willpower fusion reactor. My curiosity was partly answered when Sarah deviated from the road at the first building and sat down on the front steps. She was grabbing a water bottle out of her pack as I marched over to join her. I dumped myself on the stairs and sprawled out. I was laid down across multiple steps in a moderately comfortable, if uneven, resting position. You drive a hard pace, Captain, I jested once I caught my breath some. Oh, sorry. Was I going too fast? You could have radioed me if you wanted me to slow down. I know, it's fine. It'll get us home faster. There was a slight pause. Do you want to take a bit of a break before we continue? Yes, please. I smiled in my helmet. That'd be much appreciated. Design 3.4. I'm normally not the type of person to take sizable breaks in the middle of a task, but the climb up the mountain sapped so much energy from me that continuing without rest was the most unappealing of our options. I laid there looking up at the sky for an indeterminate amount of time. I may have fallen asleep for a portion of it as well, but I wasn't sure. Sarah was still beside me, but I was completely unaware of what she was doing, despite normally being the curious type. That was 2 for 2 of abnormal behaviors right now, but today was an abnormal day. I wasn't feeling much more energized, but I was starting to feel bad about the amount of time we'd spent here, so I began prying myself off the stairs. Once I was vertical, I looked over to see Sarah focused on the large screened device she used to measure the gas by the vent yesterday. I'm ready to go if you are. You ready? Sarah questioned, somewhat sarcastically while putting away the device. I'm ready, I repeated. Sarah got up and swung on her pack. Onward, she declared, and started walking down the branch. I started walking shortly after she left, but far before the end of the rope. I was too antsy to make progress to wait for the full draw. I let the disparity in speed for the first couple 100 meters slowly take up the slack before I matched Sarah's pace, which seemed to have slowed slightly. I suspect she was trying to be kind to me. Because this branch was one of the highest, the length before the road ended in technicality was much shorter than the lower roads. Within the distance between the platform and the step fault on branch 9, we were already clearing the last of the buildings and leaving the west settlement proper. The road continued, however, and was one of probably 2 or 3 service roads that allowed vehicle traffic between the two sides when the west half was still operational. The service road was initially like any other branch street. The mountain gently sloped up and down from either side. The lack of buildings made the slope much more apparent as we could peer down all the way down to the base of the mountain. There were still residual snow flurries which whitened the scene and obscured the exact location where land turned to ice turned to water. The road started to gently curve left, and the last buildings of the west side disappeared behind the contour of the mountain behind us. The gentle sweeping curve was eventually broken by a large outcropping of rock. It was a dozen or so meters tall and sharp in shape. It was like a wedge piercing out of the earth towards the sky and forced the road to detour around the right side of it. As we circumnavigated the intrusive feature, I saw the road beyond. There was a concave diagonal depression between the wedge and a similar rocky feature 100 meters down the path. The downhill side of the road began to drop off very quickly as the path darted left around the first outcrop and then began to curve right to follow the concavity. It was reminiscent to the rim of a bowl, with a precarious, near vertical 50-meter inward drop. The state of the road was the most worrying aspect. Because of the stone outcroppings acting as windshields, there was significant snow deposition along both the slope and the road. The 10-meter-wide ribbon of level terrain we wanted to follow quickly became enveloped in snow and seemingly disappeared into the flowing drifts. Sarah was still 1 rope's length ahead of me and stopped walking just before the snow started to obscure the road. She turned around to face me, and I could see her hand gripping the radio handset to transmit her voice. I'm going to scout the path. Be wary of where you step. The snow will want to slough off beneath you in the steeper sections. I felt anxiety start to creep in as Sarah circled back to face ahead and started shuffling out into the snow. There was about a 50-meter span from where Sarah was to where the road was recognizable again. I inched forward as Sarah did, trying to keep as much slack out as possible while also not disrupting her gait. As the incline steepened, I witnessed the snow beneath each of her footsteps threatening to shed itself and fall away. By this point, I was also venturing out onto the unstable snow. I tried my best to follow in her footsteps, experimentally testing my weight on each before applying my full weight. I was looking down at the next foothold when I was suddenly yanked by the rope, and had to hop forward into the unknown. A white plume of powdery snow obscured my vision as I drove my feet downwards and sat down as much as possible. When the snow cleared, I was half buried in snow, sitting on the slope about a meter down from the original set of footprints. I traced the route of the tether with my eyes to find Sarah a good 10 meters down the incline, almost completely buried. A powdery chute of disrupted snow marked the route she had slid down. I had one hand on the rope and used the other to radio over to her. "Hey, you okay?" I watched as Sarah floundered around for a second in the white quicksand before I heard an exasperated, "Yeah, I'm fine," come through my headset. I sighed a little bit of relief. "So, what's the plan now, Captain?" I watched as she lamely flailed around some more before giving up. "You're gonna have to get to a spot where you can pull me out. I'm stuck." "You're stuck?" "I'm stuck," she replied defeatedly. I looked around my surroundings. "I've got nothing firm here, and not enough rope to get back. I'm assuming unclipping is the worst option." "Yeah, don't do that." There was a pause while we both thought. Sarah broke the silence first. "You think you have enough rope to get to the solid ground on the other side?" I sized up the distances by eye. I was about the halfway point, and Sarah had slipped from a rope's length in front of me. Doing the quick math, it looked like it added up, but it would be close. "I think it would be possible, but I've got nothing to catch me if the snow slides out on me." "Just hope it doesn't." "That's not a real answer," I snapped back. I was nervous at the idea. "You have any better ideas? So far as I see it, there are 3 outcomes here. First, you get across, get me out, and we go home today. Second, you try to get across, fail, and we both sit here until comms are back up. Or third, you don't try, and we sit here until comms are back up anyway. I'm not seeing a whole lot of downsides." "That's assuming I don't break my neck on the way down." "That's assuming you don't break your neck on the way down," she affirmed. I let out a shaky sigh. "Fine." I flipped over onto my stomach and crawled as best as I could back up the slope. The rope had been pulled taut by Sarah's fall, so I had to take a forward arcing path to get back to the footsteps where I had some indication of the solidity. I used the increased surface area of my 4 limbs on the ground to try to persuade the snow into keeping put. Despite the extra effort required, I followed the remaining footprints, staying flat to the slope and strafing sideways with my feet downward. I wasn't willing to take any extra risks with the ever-present threat of being trapped in the snow for an indeterminate amount of days with no food and little water. It was very slow progress, but I passed over the top of Sarah and the chute marking her location to start making new progress. Much to the easement of my tense nerves, the incline leveled out noticeably beyond that point. I felt the last remaining slack pull out of the rope and go tight as I found the first patches of semi-solid terrain. I posted up on my hands and knees and gave the rope, which was now roded between my legs and down the slope, a tug to see if there was any remaining distance it was willing to offer me. I reached up and gripped my radio. "I got to something solid. You ready?" "Yes, sir." I found some solid footing and planted my boots. I then leaned my weight against the rope as far forward as possible, almost reaching a 45-degree angle with the ground. The rope barely budged as I strained against it. It then began to shift, shimmy, and creep its way up. Most of the progress was likely Sarah swimming her way out, with me providing an upward lift just enough to make it possible. My energy-depleted legs screamed with lactic acid over the minutes of constant pressure and tiny yet monumental steps forward along the road. After what felt like an eternity, the rope began to travel with ever-increasing pace, until finally it went slack enough to drop me flat on my face. I rolled over onto my back, closed my eyes, and hoped that meant Sarah had crested the hill. I was startled by a knock on my visor, and opened my eyes to see Sarah peering down at me. "Good job, man. Take 5. Design 3.5. Sarah walked off somewhere out of my field of view, and I continued to lay there. I groaned and flopped about in latent pain and stiffness. I was going to be sore tomorrow. I rolled over onto my side to see Sarah sat down cross-legged a couple meters away from me. I was too tired to say anything, and instead kept rolling to get my hands underneath me and prop myself up. I knew the longer I stayed immobile, the harder it would be to get moving again. I labored myself upright and started staggering down the road towards our destination. "Let's get moving before I turn to stone," I declared while walking away. I wasn't sure if I said it loud enough for Sarah to hear, but the message was clear enough, and it was as much for my own personal motivation as anything else. A couple steps later, I realized I didn't really know the way back. I brushed it off and figured it would be hard to get lost on a single road, and I would know my way back once we got to the east side. I felt the rope tighten ever so slightly and slacken again, likely from reaching the end of the tether and Sarah starting to follow along. Much to my relief, the service road continued along a flat, pleasurably uninteresting route until the first buildings of the east side started to crop into view along the mountainside. There was a dull elation in knowing our journey was coming to a close. When we reached the buildings on the east branch 15, I looked around for signs of damage. The snow on the road was considerably better off than on the west side. The entire surface was still pockmarked, but it lacked the massive craters that tell tale of the largest ice chunks we witnessed. Some of the building's windows had been smashed, but none of the concrete had holes punched through it. That was particularly reassuring to me, because I didn't want to spend another night in my thermal suit if our house had a gaping puncture in the roof. I suspected that the metal-roofed buildings likely would have sustained the most damage. I jumped slightly when I noticed Sarah had walked up alongside me. I had been too engrossed in the buildings to notice her making up ground. She had unclipped from the rope and was coiling it up as she walked. I suppose it made sense that we wouldn't need it now that we were back in charted territory. I unclipped the carabiner from the loop on my suit and held the last of the rope aloft while she finished coiling it. Once finished, she slung the rope over her head and shoulder like a sash. The next bit of good news came in the form of an operational lift. I could see the cables held aloft and the gondolas traveling up and down when we were a couple 100 meters from Trunk Street. There were a couple other people walking Branch 15. One person was walking back from Trunk Street holding a new window pane, and another was cradling a log-sized canister of expanding insulation foam. We passed the administration building and reached Trunk Street. We had to wait for one of the large, tracked transport vehicles to drive past before we could cross. These transport vehicles were up to 10 meters long and 5 or 6 meters wide. They had 4 massive tank tracks on each corner that looked much like the single track of the jet sled. They had a cab-over design, which gave them a funny, flat-faced appearance, with the driver compartment high and at the very forefront of the vehicle. The rear 3/4 of the length was a flat metal bed with tie-down points running the edges. This particular vehicle was carrying a stack of straight and curved metal beams that would comprise the roof reinforcing hoops of the large buildings. The vehicle took a hard left to enter one of the parking lots of the administration building, and once clear of the road, Sarah and I started crossing Trunk Street to reach the lift platform. We stood without talking on the platform for 30 or so seconds for the next gondola to swing past. I could hear the chirps and squeaks of the cable pulleys on the lift support, the turbines of the transport vehicle across the street still spooling down, and miscellaneous grinding, chipping, and drilling could be heard from a building a little further down the slope. I felt the activity of the rebuild process was somehow soothing. We hopped on the next gondola as it swung past, and I continued to both contemplate and enjoy observing people milling around the various buildings, fixing or replacing damaged items. It reminded me of ants after their nest got disturbed. The lift quickly reached Branch 15, where we made our exit. Being in familiar territory somehow made the last couple minutes of the journey feel easier. I think it was probably because my mind was already so conditioned on this street that I couldn't help but space out. Upon reaching the front door of our house, I swung it open and stumbled inside. I immediately stripped out of the thermal helmet and suit. I couldn't wait to be free of the extra bulk. It was amazingly apparent how badly I needed a shower after peeling my greasy carcass out. I walked over to the garage door and lobbed the thermal suit out as to not stink up the living area. I'd attend to it later. I had made my way over to the freezer and was rifling through for something to eat when I heard footsteps racing down the upstairs hallway. "Oh my God, are you guys okay?" Emily exclaimed when she reached the bottom of the stairs. "Yeah, we're fine," Sarah and I both replied almost synchronously. Emily exhaled a big sigh and then abruptly took in more air to speak again. "It all happened so fast here, I can't believe it. One second it was all normal, and the next there were basically boulders falling from the sky. I knew you guys were out, but I wasn't sure what you were up to, so I was so worried." I listened to Emily machine gun more words while I put the ration I found in the flash oven. Sarah injected into Emily's speech. "We're fine, don't worry. Where's Evan?" "Downstairs like usual. Probably sleeping or playing video games." "Okay, so we're all accounted for. Any damage to the house?" "Not that I could find. I was worried with how loud it all got." "Okay, good. That makes our life easy." The oven chimed and I grabbed the mitts to take out my food. Once food was in hand, I found a plastic cup from the cupboard and filled it full of water to accompany my meal. Sarah and Emily continued to rattle off more topics while I slinked upstairs to eat. I didn't dislike listening to Emily, but I was far too tired to have her in my ears at the minute. I wolfed down the piping hot food while I was draped into the desk chair in my room. Once finished, I left the empty metal tray and dirty utensil on the desk, then gathered up some clean clothes to take a shower. There were 2 bathrooms in the house. One was downstairs next to Sarah's room, and the other was on the second floor, just a little way past Emily's room. Both of them looked almost identical, with the same basic facilities. There was a small sink on a porcelain pedestal, a mirror on the wall behind that, a toilet just next to both, and a small shower stall in the rear. Upon entering the upstairs bathroom, I placed my fresh clothes on some hooks that also held the towels on the wall opposite the sink. Turning around and getting a look at myself in the mirror was a stark reminder of how drained I was. My face looked relatively gaunt, and my eyes were bloodshot, making me look like I was turning into some sort of cave-dwelling goblin. My medium-length brown hair was slick, greasy, and matted from spending 2 days inside a helmet, and the patchy stubble that lined my jaw made me look unkempt. I wasn't particularly bothered by it, though, and after 20 minutes soaking in the hot water and stretching out as much as the cramped shower space would allow, I almost felt human again. I returned to my room and crashed on the bed. I didn't even check what time it was before conking out. I was too exhausted to care. This concludes today's assembly. Tune in again for more of Reaper Point Volcanology. Until next time, have a good one.